I feel like we are really fractured in terms of politics and in terms of polarity. And I would say let's stop adding to that problem and instead let's try to talk to people who are really different from us, no matter who they voted for, and say, hey, who are you as a person? We actually are a lot more similar than you think.
Today we are talking with Shahzeen Attari, a professor at the O'Neill School of Public and Environmental Affairs at Indiana University. Her work on climate action has received media attention from major news outlets, including the BBC, The Economist, The New York Times, and NPR. Welcome to the show, Shahzeen.
Thanks for having me.
Hello, Shahzeen. Thank you for coming. So I would like to start us off with the first question. So being from Mumbai, India, how has this shaped your perception of environmental challenges?
So it's interesting that you think I'm from Mumbai. I was born there, but I grew up in Dubai, and I spent 18 years of my life in the United Arab Emirates. And then I came to the US for my undergrad, grad school, postdoc, and now my job. And so I think being from sort of the India diaspora, but also belonging both to India as well as the United Arab Emirates, has really shaped the way I think about the environment. And growing up in the UAE, I got to see how the country just changed almost in a decade from a desert to a metropolis. And it was very, very stark. So you get to see what development looks like in your timeline, in your lifetime. And so that really shaped what the impact people have on the environment. And then when I came to the US, I actually studied physics and math in Urbana-Champaign, and then I volunteered for Nature Conservancy, and I was hooked on studying the environment. So that's kind of my path to really just trying to understand what is the relationship people have with the world around us.
So I saw that you wrote on your lab bio that you were a sci-fi lover. So I would like to know, how has your love for sci-fi influenced the way you approach your work, if it does?
Oh my goodness, I love science fiction. So science fiction sometimes also meets science reality, right? So you can imagine things that have been written in sci-fi books decades ago that now have come to life. Things like the internet or gene editing. And so I think science fiction allows us to take what is real and based in science, but extrapolate from that. And so it helps me understand where the world can go. How can we imagine what the future world might look like? What are things that we can do today that can help shape the characteristics of that landscape? And so that's really what I'm interested in. And there are a lot of writers that actually deal with climate fiction. And so a lot of it is dystopic, so it's really bleak. But there are some amazing books out there that help me understand, hey, this is what we might look for in imagining what that world is. Because in a way, I think of us all as with the future and how climate change is shaping the future and the present as riding on a bicycle, but we're blindfolded. So we don't really know where we're going. And so we need to figure out where we're going. And science fiction helps me do that.
So my next question is about your education. So while making our research, we saw that you had a bachelor in engineering physics at the University of Illinois, a master in civil and environmental engineering from Carnegie Mellon University, as well as a PhD in civil and environmental engineering, as well as public policy at Carnegie Mellon University. What inspired you to do all that?
Someone might look at that and just think I was really lost, lost in the woods. But I think there's a method to the madness, right? So when I was growing up in Dubai, I really loved fine art. So that's drawing and painting.
Yes.
And I loved physics and math and science, like biology.
Yeah.
And so I talked to my mom and dad, and my dad sort of sat me down and he's like, you know what? Why don't you do the physics degree? Because that might help you with employment in the future. And so I did physics and math at our Urbana-Champaign, which was a phenomenal degree. Professors there really took their time with me And I worked in a lot of different labs. So I worked in a lab on condensed matter, and then I worked in a super interdisciplinary lab with biologists, fluorescence imaging microscopy, and entomologists, all in the same lab. And so that sort of started my journey on interdisciplinary work. I got into the master's program at Carnegie Mellon, and I had to take a risk on myself. I had to take out a loan and figure out, all right, am I really going to be successful at doing this? It was pretty scary. So they put me into the master's program, and then I was able to get into the PhD program after a year, which was the year that a paper came out called Stabilization Wedges. And the first sentence of the paper says, hey, society already has the technical know-how to solve the climate problem. So I started asking questions about, hey, why haven't we done all of these solutions already? And that led me to studying people. And so that's how I got really interested in cognition and psychology and social behavior.
So your teaching at Indiana University has earned praise for being both engaging and thought-provoking. An example of it will be you winning the IU Bicentennial in 2020. What is your favorite aspect of teaching at IU?
There's so many aspects that I really like about teaching. I think every class is unique because of the students that are in the course, and I learn a lot from my students. So, for example, right now I'm teaching a course on energy systems and transition, and it has 21 students, and it's a master's class. And I've got students who are from Nigeria, from Iran, from Israel, from Gambia, and Malawi. For some of these, I've never been to most of these countries. And so when they come into the course, I ask them about, hey, what's happening with the energy transition in their country of origin?
Yes.
And so I feel like teaching is not top down for me, but it's more like a tango where I'm dancing with the entire class and I get to learn something because I'm a really curious person. So it kind of feeds who I am.
So how do you incorporate your research and interests like storytelling or sci-fi, for example, in your classes to inspire students?
Sometimes they wonder what I'm doing, which is pretty common. So, for example, I teach a course on human behavior and energy consumption, and I make them read Ursula Le Guin's short story. I think it's called Those Who Walk Away from Omelis. So it talks about, like, who should pay the price for society's development. And so I think, and I try to bring that in. And in fact, in my course, the human behavior course, students have to actually go out there into the real world and change behavior and create YouTube videos about it. And so they become storytellers as a function of doing the work, similar to how you all are becoming podcasters and storytellers from a function of being in your professor's class. And I think that's really, really interesting. A lot of those experiments fail, and that's okay. But I think through the failure, there's a lot of learning.
We wanted to touch on a little bit the storytelling that you just mentioned. How did that become a key component to your teachings?
Here's why I think storytelling is important. I think storytelling helps me blend fact with feeling, the heart with the mind. I think in many ways, scientists tend to be more mind-focused and creatives tend to be more heart-focused. And here is a place where we can merge the two. Show me a person that does not love a good story, right? Richard Powers actually once wrote that the only thing that can really, truly change people is a good story. And so when you think about how we navigate our world, we're going through narratives about what people believe about the world, about what shapes our society, who should be in charge, why should they be in charge, where does change come from? And so in many ways, I think narratives shape our ability to deal with real-world problems. And if you just take that further, stories help us understand and make sense of the world around us. And I think we need to have better stories for what those worlds look like. Otherwise, people don't know what we're fighting for.
We saw that you actually won an award for this in 2024 and that you had to go to the Storymakers program. What was that like and how did that change or add to your approach with storytelling?
Okay, so this was an amazing fellowship out of University of Southern California through the Wrigley Center there. And the fellowship was mind-blowing. So they actually helped train faculty across and academics across the United States on how to become effective storytellers. And one person who I met was Ed Yong, who is a science writer. And he basically did a session on how to write effectively for a much more general audience. And when you look at academic writing, it tends to be very straitjacketed, whereas writing for popular audiences tends to sort of allow the writer to hold your hand and walk through the forest, which is really different from the type of writing that I know how to do. And so I'm actually trying my hand at writing, and something I've never done before. It's really terrifying because it's really different from academic writing, but I want to try my hand at that because I don't know, given where we are today, I don't know how much of a change just academic papers alone are going to make. And I think we need stories from a variety of different people. So different stories work for different people. We need more stories about where we're heading. And I don't think stories are a panacea because stories can also be mobilized for nefarious actors. So I think we need to be careful about both managing expectations with what is real, because stories tend to suspend disbelief sometimes, but also help us understand what the science is really saying in as much as possible.
We were speaking before the podcast about new administration and sort of the polarizing nature of climate change. So we were just curious to hear you kind of speak to the polarization of the topic in general, and then what you think the next 4 years are going to look like for us.
Honestly, I'm really scared about what the next 4 years will look like. So what's interesting is that it doesn't really matter whether you're Republican, Democrat, liberal, conservative, whether you care about climate change should be agnostic, really. We're all in this together. This is our one planet, right? A lot of people in my field think that 1.5 degrees is out of bounds now. And so that means we're going to have to plan for a warmer world. And I think that there's going to be less action on the federal level, and we're going to have to act much more strongly at the state and local level. And it's all hands on deck.
Do you mind just giving just a quick brief, the 1.5 degrees, where that came from and what that means for people who might not know?
Sure. So what that means is that we talk about carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere, and we measure that in parts per million. And so we have warmed our planet 1.2 degrees so far since pre-industrial times. And it feels, again, psychologically, it might seem like I can deal with another degree, but that has a lot of ramifications, including melting glaciers, sea level rise, heat waves, wildfire threats increase, hurricanes get more powerful, heat waves, drought. So in the United States, we're in a moderate drought right now. And so everything just starts, it's a multiplier of a lot of different problems. The big challenge that we're facing with the current administration that we will face is that, people's pocketbooks are hurting. And the challenge is that if you start deregulating, that means some of the climate goals that we have are not going to be tenable. And that's going to lead to a huge decrease in welfare down the line. But because of psychology, we're very myopic. We care about today much more than we do about the future. And so that's, again, another place where psychology comes in.
So, Shahzeen, I'm curious as to what are some of the top myths in environmental consumption and conservation that you've encountered in your work?
There's so many, because I've been in this area for at least a decade and a half. So I'll tell you some of the top ones. The first one is that there's nothing I can do to help with the problem of climate change. There's always something you can do. Whatever skills you have can be fostered towards helping with the solution. The second thing is not knowing what to do. And there's so much that you can do, everything from activism to trying to get people who are in policy roles to act, to changing your own behavior. And then within changing your own behavior, a lot of people historically have thought turning off the lights is like the best thing that they can do to solve climate. It's actually it's not. It's a pretty small action. Some of the other actions that you can do is, being part of the electrification revolution that's happening. Think about electrifying everything in your home, buying energy efficient appliances, trying to stay more local and traveling less, which is a lot harder. Even as I say that, I tend to travel quite a bit, and it's really hard for me to travel less, even though I do.
What advice would you give someone to gain more information about how to change their actions and what can actually make a difference?
So there's so much information online, and I know that information online now is problematic, but look for sources that are credible, like the Department of Energy, the Environmental Protection Agency, read papers in the field. But there's a lot of information online about what people can do about climate change. And I think we need to change the social norms. How do we do that? We can start here. What are some things that students can do, faculty can do to bring more awareness to the problem? And there's so much that we can do. We can start talking about it. So the next time you're on a hot date with someone, or the next time you have a friends gathering, just, talk about climate and anxiety and grief that's surrounding it. Because I think we cannot be like ostriches. We can't just put our head in the ground and say, this is really scary. There's nothing I can do. Yeah. I'm still on the side of the fight, So that's still based on the science. There's still so much we can do. We can still prevent a 4-degree world, a 3-degree world. And so I'm still sort of in that space that we still need to figure out how to empower people to not feel like they're a drop in the bucket.
Absolutely.
How do you think social media plays a role in raising awareness?
I think that's such a good question.
Yeah.
I left all of social media maybe 6 years ago, I think, because I found it to be super toxic. I think each person needs to find what they're good at. And when you get worn out, you just tap out. Someone else will step in. And so if you are good at social media and navigating the very fast pace and the sometimes the crazy shit that gets thrown your way, then go for it. I think that is its own skill, one that I do not have. But I think it can be really powerful in raising awareness. And also people who are celebrities talking about getting out the vote or why climate action is important, but also everyday people. I think, we talked a little bit about polarization, and there's so much polarization around climate, but I don't know why there should be. I think we need to find ways to bridge these broken bonds of affection.
Can you touch on the perils of shaming and blaming and how that creates polarization in the United States? Or in the world in general, actually?
Sure. So there's lots of books that have been written about guilt and shaming, about how powerful it can be. And we've seen it act out. For example, when the plastic straw got stuck in a turtle's nose, there was a huge backlash. And social media was actually responsible for sharing that information. And then Starbucks and others basically said, all right, we're going to get rid of plastic straws. Now, granted, plastic straws are a very teeny-weeny sliver of the entire plastic ecosystem, but that's kind of tells you how shaming and blaming can work in a positive way. There's also the challenge of ad hominem attacks on climate researchers because of their carbon footprint. So this is an area that we've studied quite a bit in our lab, is that what is the effect of me giving a talk about climate change and climate action and then having flown to a particular place to give that talk or having a large carbon footprint. And so I think we need to figure out what a different way of living looks like. One that is more deeply connected and one where we can reimagine even what our capitalist structure looks like. What would it look like if we didn't just primarily rely on growth, no matter what? And I know these are sort of super controversial things to say out loud, but I think why not work on what that might even look like? And there's also this idea of decoupling. So that's been happening right now in multiple societies where we're decoupling, where we're delinking energy intensity from GDP growth. And that's another idea. Is are we able to sort of peel back the amount of energy that we're using in different pieces of our economy and start stabilizing much more deeply and start using more efficient technologies? So that's one version of the future. There are many versions of the future.
So I loved your TEDx talk back in 2014 where you discussed conserving energy and water and basically just how us as consumers, our simple day-to-day tasks such as using the toilet or doing our laundry affects the environment so much. I'm curious as to what has changed since then.
Thank you for watching that. I think we're using more efficient technologies in our homes. Our energy use is relatively flat, but it might be going up because of artificial intelligence and data centers. The role of electricity in our society is actually growing, so we need a lot more generation. To be honest, I'm not sure how much has changed. There's still a lot we need to do. And sometimes it can be really disheartening. We need to start talking about our role in both the problem as well as the solution.
For sure. I feel like it's common that people recognize there's an issue and they're like, we want to change and we want to make a difference, but then they just don't put the actions into a process. And so I feel like that's one of the main things. Like we talked about the motivation deficit. Some people just like are used to their simple day-to-day routines and they don't want to adapt to something different. So
I love that. And if you guys can figure it out, we need lots of solutions. So
So we did a little bit of research into your labs here at Indiana, and we wanted to know what about the labs do you feel you can get that your classes don't teach?
So in our lab, we have students who are undergrads, master's students. In the past, we've had PhD students all working together on a problem. And it's a relatively flat structure so that anyone can sort of jump in, work on a problem. We've co-authored papers together on different problems that students have wanted to work on, including one which was about why is it that turning off the lights is such a sticky heuristic and problematic heuristic. So this was led by two undergrad students who wanted to work on this problem. And we ran a survey. We basically collected the data together, analyzed the data together, and we wrote the paper together. And so I think working in this way keeps the ideas super fresh, super interesting. It helps me understand how different people see the problem. And then it also is pretty wonderful to see where the students take the work once they leave and following their careers and their trajectories.
So you just touched a little bit about your own inner polarity. So I would like to know how would you help others that are going through the same thing, for example? Which kind of advice would you give them?
I tried not flying for a while, and that was really hard because my family, as you mentioned earlier, lives in India.
Yeah.
And I waited a really long time before going back to visit. So I found that was hard. Some people have given up flying altogether. I find that there are lots of challenges we face as people, right? Yeah. Am I a city person, or do I want to live in New York City, or do I want to live in Bloomington, Indiana? Do I want to spend more of my time teaching or more of my time doing research? What type of play do I want to engage with? Like what gives me joy in the world? How do I make space and time for that? And I think all of these involve trade-offs. So you need to sacrifice something to get something. And I think that that's sometimes really hard because we might want it all. You know, I teach this course on energy systems and transition. And there's plastic everywhere in our lives, like everything.
Yes.
And it's tied to climate because plastic is actually a byproduct of fossil fuels. Yeah. And so if you connect it back, it's actually yet another stream of waste. And it has so many different issues related to it, right? So it comes from fossil fuels. People don't know what plastics can be recycled. And our recycling system is really messed up.
Yes.
And so a very small amount of plastic actually gets recycled. A lot of it ends up in places where it shouldn't, like the ocean or in developing countries where they have to deal with our waste. So there are lots of equity issues, there are lots of justice issues, there are lots of challenges. And the thing is, if I said, hey, I just want to stop using plastic the way you did, it would be really, 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 really hard.
Yeah.
And so the question is, how do we make system changes a little bit easier for people?
If you had to, you're dealing with a difficult uncle or whatever, and he's saying there is no such thing as climate change, what are 2 or 3 things that we can say to combat that and still keep some peace?
There are a couple of ways, and there are people in my life like that too. And these are not sort of researched, but this is just from my personal experience. I would say, all right, you don't believe that the climate is warming. What prevents us from taking the actions that are needed to deal with climate change, that are also really very well actions that can help us use less energy, have less air pollution that is good for both our health and everyone else's health, give people more access to energy. And so, all right, maybe you don't need to go through the path of believing that this is a problem, but maybe there are other ways, other parallel paths that will still get us to the solution. So that is one thing I could think of. And then you can break bread and drink wine together, and hopefully that helps. So that's one thing. The other couple of things that I would say listeners are probably already doing is start talking about the problem, start activating about the problem. And whatever you're really good at, try to put it through a climate lens and see how that can help with the solutions, because we really are running out of time. So if it's whether it's podcasting or making movies or writing stories. The last thing is, I feel like we are really fractured in terms of politics and in terms of polarity. And I would say, let's stop adding to that problem, and instead, let's try to talk to people who are really different from us, no matter who they voted for, and say, hey, who are you as a person? We actually are a lot more similar than you think. And I think I'm starting to do that. Sometimes it leads to some really tough conversations, but I would encourage listeners to also try to do that.
Yeah, I think finding common ground is something that these guys have talked about a lot. And I feel like the polarity is just, it sparks. Where do we disagree? Where do we, differ, instead of where can we agree? I think that's a good idea of just sort of like piggybacking it on something else that is, whether it's health or wellness.
Or wildlife or nature, walks in the woods that have started changing, trees have started dying. So it's just finding what helps people see things more clearly.
We are so thrilled that you're doing this work and that you are using storytelling and persuasion, and hopefully all these guys can take I liked your advice too of taking something you're good at and putting it through a climate lens. I think that's actually really smart.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah.
This was
Thank
great.
you so much for meeting with us.
Thank you so much. You were amazing.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode. This episode was created and produced at the IU Media School as part of the Beautiful Thinkers podcast, IU Edition. To follow along this season, check out The Beautiful Thinkers on Instagram and LinkedIn. Special thanks to Bella Grimaldi for our music and the students who researched and recorded this episode, AJ Rodano, May Wallet Mohammed, and Gracie Westlake.